I've known a good many men who built their doubt into something they were quietly proud of. A wall they mistook for wisdom, a habit they called good judgment. Garrett Foss was exactly that kind of man this summer. His threshing machine broke, and a woman he had never met fixed it before the storm arrived. I am going to tell you that story because I think you need to hear it. And because I suspect you may have been standing on the wrong side of that fence, at least once in your own life. The machine at the Foss farm in Dolores County, Colorado had been silent for 4 days when Nessa Caldwell stepped off the westbound stage in August of 1889. 4 mechanics from the town of Carver's Crossing had already attempted the repair. 3 of them arriving together on the second day, working over the cylinder drum with increasing frustration for most of the morning, and leaving before noon without a solution. The 4th had come the following morning alone, examined the same problem with more patience than the first 3 combined, and departed the following afternoon without having solved it. Garrett Foss paid each of them for their time, and watched them go down the road, with the particular controlled fury of a man who understood that the storm season in Dolores County did not negotiate with broken equipment. The wheat in the upper fields had been standing ready for 12 days. Every additional day it stood dry and uncut was another day the stalks grew more brittle, shaking loose grain onto the ground before the machine ever touched them. He had perhaps 5 days of weather remaining, maybe 4. He had advertised in the Carver's Crossing Courier 3 weeks earlier for someone to manage the farm operation during the upcoming harvest, coordinate the hands, oversee the equipment, make the decisions that needed making quickly when Garrett himself was occupied with the buyers coming down from Denver. The advertisement had described the position in plain terms: capable person, experience with farm management, steady temperament required. He received 7 replies. Nessa Caldwell's had been the most direct of the 7. A single page, no flourishes, stating plainly that she had managed equipment and personnel on her family's operation in New Mexico for 6 years and was prepared to begin immediately. Garrett had hired her without meeting her on the strength of the letter's tone alone, which he would later describe as either the best or worst decision he had made that year, depending on which hour of that particular afternoon you asked him. Nessa Caldwell arrived with a single leather bag and an expression that suggested she had not come to be impressed. She was 33 years old, dark-haired, and had the direct way of looking at things. People, machinery, problems, that some women develop when they spend enough years in rooms where no one initially expects them to know what they are talking about. The stage driver who delivered her to the Foss property had the sense, afterward, that she had been taking inventory from the moment the farm came into view, noting what was well maintained and what wasn't, the way a person reads a place before they ever speak to the people living in it. Garrett met her at the gate. He was 42, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that didn't volunteer much information. He shook her hand the way he shook any new hire's hand, briefly, efficiently, and began explaining the farm's current situation with the flat delivery of a man who had decided somewhere in the past year that the shortest path between 2 points was the only path worth taking. He described the harvest timeline and the weather. He did not immediately mention the threshing machine, because he had not yet decided what to do about it, and Garrett Foss did not discuss problems he had not yet formed a position on. Nessa saw the machine anyway. It was sitting in the equipment yard behind the main barn, and even from the gate road she could read the way it sat. The stillness of something that should be moving, the particular inertia of a machine that had seized mid-operation. She asked, after Garrett finished his summary of the harvest situation, what was wrong with the thresher. Garrett said it had been down 4 days, and that 4 mechanics from town had not been able to resolve it. Nessa looked at the machine for a moment, from where they were standing, and then asked whether she might take a look at it. Garrett said, with the tone of a man extending a courtesy he didn't believe would produce anything, that she was welcome to, though he expected her time might be better spent reviewing the field tallies and understanding the harvest rotation before they lost more daylight. He said it without condescension, or at least without the kind he would have been able to identify in himself, simply as a practical matter of priorities. It did not occur to him in that moment that his new farm manager, a woman who had managed a full operation in New Mexico for 6 years, might be looking at a broken thresher and recognizing something that 4 mechanics from Carver's Crossing had missed entirely. To understand why Garrett Foss doubted his new hire so thoroughly within an hour of her arrival, you need to understand what the previous 2 years had already cost him in misplaced confidence. 18 months before Nessa's arrival, Garrett had entered into a partnership with a man named Alderton Beck, a grain broker out of Pueblo, who had described a pricing arrangement with the Denver buyers in terms that were, as Garrett eventually discovered, almost entirely fictional. Beck had presented figures, references, and a contract that appeared sound, and Garrett, who considered himself a careful man, had reviewed everything twice before signing. He lost nearly a full season's revenue in the 12 months that followed, As the arrangement turned out to be a series of verbal agreements Beck had made with buyers who had never confirmed them in writing, and felt no particular obligation to honor. By the time Garrett understood the full shape of what had happened, Beck had moved his operation to Utah, and the money was simply gone. Since then, Garrett had made a private rule of trusting nothing that had not been demonstrated in front of his own eyes. Letters, references, credentials, descriptions of capability. All of it sat in a provisional category in his mind until the proof appeared in the actual work. It was, he told himself, a reasonable habit for a man who had been deceived once by paper and words. What he had not fully noticed was how broadly he had applied that rule, and how consistently it landed with particular weight on people whose competence arrived in a form he had not expected, and therefore had not extended credit for in advance. Nessa Caldwell's competence arrived in a form Garrett Foss had not expected at all. She had grown up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, the only child of a blacksmith named Cutter Caldwell who had expanded over the course of her childhood, from simple ironwork into the repair and maintenance of the farm machinery beginning to arrive in the territory through the 1870s. Her father had taught her the logic of machines the way some fathers teach their children the logic of numbers, as a language, a system of cause and effect that behaved the same way every time, provided you read it correctly. Nessa had taken to that language the way certain people take to music, naturally, early, and with a precision that exceeded what she'd been formally taught. By the time she was 16, she was diagnosing problems her father brought to her for a second opinion. By 20, she was the one the neighboring farms called first, when something broke and time was short. The difficulty was not with the machines. Machines behaved the way they were supposed to behave. The difficulty was with the people who owned them, ranchers and farmers, who had no trouble calling on Cutter Caldwell when their equipment failed, but who received his daughter's diagnosis with a particular quality of attention that meant they intended to verify it with someone else before acting on it. She had learned to work within that reality rather than against it. She had learned to present her findings in terms that left the other person feeling they had arrived at the conclusion themselves. She had learned, in other words, the same kind of patient, indirect approach that every person learns who spends enough years being right in rooms that were not built for them. Her father had died in 1885, leaving the operation to Nessa outright. A fact that surprised some of his neighbors and none of his regular customers, who had understood for years where the actual diagnostic skill resided. She managed it alone for 3 years before the combination of a poor harvest season and a water rights dispute with an adjacent property made the economics of continuing too difficult to justify. She left New Mexico in 1888, looking for a situation that wanted what she actually had to offer rather than merely tolerating it. The advertisement from Garrett Foss had described a farm in need of a capable manager and had not specified that the manager needed to be any particular kind of person, which Nessa had taken, with the earned pragmatism of a woman who had learned to read advertisements carefully, as possibly the most promising thing she had seen in 8 months of looking. Here is the thing neither of them could see yet. Standing at the gate of the Foss farm with a broken thresher, sitting 30 yards behind the barn. Garrett needed someone who could prove a claim, rather than simply make one. He had been sold enough words that turned out to be only words, and what he actually required, though he would not have been able to name it clearly in that moment, was someone whose competence arrived through the work itself, rather than through any description of it. Nessa needed a place where the work itself was what mattered, where being right about a machine counted for something on its own terms, without having to perform the additional labor of convincing anyone she was capable of being right. What looked to both of them like a simple employment arrangement was actually something considerably more specific. A situation that was about to give each of them exactly what they had spent several years trying to find. Nessa walked to the thresher without asking again for permission. Garrett followed, still describing the harvest rotation, and trailed off when he noticed she was already crouching beside the cylinder housing, with her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to the machine as much as looking at it. She asked him what sound it had made when it ceased. Garrett told her. She asked which direction the drum had been rotating when it stopped. He told her that as well, and then added, in the tone of a man re-establishing the practical limits of what was possible, that the 4 mechanics from town had already examined the cylinder housing extensively, and had not been able to identify the cause without dismantling the entire drum assembly, a job that would take 2 days minimum even if replacement parts were available locally, which they were not. Nessa said, still crouching, that she would need until sundown. Garrett said, with the particular patience of a man who had heard confident claims before, that he appreciated her willingness, but that the machine had already absorbed 4 professionals' attention without result, and he did not want her to spend her first day on something that might simply be beyond repair, without factory parts. Nessa looked up at him from beside the housing. She said she understood his concern. She also said that the 4 mechanics had all been looking at the cylinder drum, and that she did not believe the cylinder drum was where the problem was. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with less certainty than he'd intended, that she was welcome to look. Nessa said she would need until sundown and would prefer to work without anyone standing over her for the first hour, since she needed to think through what she was hearing from the machine. And that was easier to do without an audience behind her. Garrett found the specificity of the condition curious enough that he agreed to it. He went back to the house to review the field tallies, which was what he had said she should be doing anyway, and sat down at his desk and found that he could not entirely concentrate on the numbers. His foreman, a lean and watchful man named Tuck Renner, who had been with the Foss farm for 7 years, had been observing the conversation from the equipment barn doorway. After Garrett went inside, Tuck walked over to the thresher and watched Nessa work for perhaps 10 minutes without speaking. Then he went back to his own work, slowly, with the expression of a man still thinking through something he hadn't finished yet. In the first hour Nessa made no sound that suggested progress. She moved around the machine methodically, touching things in sequence, occasionally pressing her ear directly against the housing in a way that Garrett, watching from his office window, more than he reviewed the field tallies, found strange to observe. She did not reach for tools in the first hour. She did not remove any panels. She simply moved around the machine, listening and looking, and occasionally writing brief notes in a small book she carried in her shirt pocket. Tuck Renner drifted back toward the thresher near the end of the first hour, carrying a length of fence wire he needed to pretend he was delivering somewhere, and stood at a respectful distance. After a few minutes he said, without particular inflection, that the town mechanics had all started directly on the cylinder drum. Nessa said she knew. She said the cylinder drum was not where the problem was. Tuck asked where she thought the problem was. Nessa said she believed it was in the drive chain tensioner, that the chain had jumped its guide during a high-load pass, and the resulting torque spike had driven a fragment of the guide housing into the drum bearing, which had seized the drum without actually breaking it. She said that if she was right, the drum itself was intact, and the repair was a matter of clearing the fragment and resetting the chain guide, which she could accomplish with what was already in the equipment barn. Tuck said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly that sounded like it might be something. Garrett, coming out of the house to bring himself a cup of water, and finding himself walking toward the equipment yard instead, arrived in the second hour to find Nessa lying on her back underneath the machine, with a lamp and a narrow probe, doing something he could not clearly see from where he was standing. She said, without emerging from under the machine, that she had found the fragment. Garrett stood at the edge of the machine's shadow, and said nothing. Tuck, standing nearby, said quietly to Garrett that she had called the problem in the first hour, without touching a single tool, which was not something any of the town mechanics had done. Garrett said it was one diagnosis. The proof was whether she could clear it. He said it mostly to himself, and both men at the edge of the shadow understood that much. By early afternoon, word had moved the way word moves on working farms, without anyone formally announcing anything, simply through the particular quality of attention that spreads when something unexpected is happening. 2 of the field hands appeared in the equipment yard on invented reasons, staying at the edges. A neighboring farmer named Dolph Stroud had ridden over to discuss the shared fence line on the north boundary, and had stayed without anyone inviting him, because he had heard about the broken thresher and was curious how it would resolve. Nessa worked through the audience's arrival without acknowledging it. She was not performing. She was working, which is a different thing entirely, and the people watching gradually understood the distinction, and grew quiet in the way people do when they recognize they are watching something that does not require their reaction to proceed. By mid-afternoon she had cleared the fragment, a piece of cast-iron guide housing no larger than a man's thumbnail, seated in the drum bearing at an angle that had locked the drum completely without visibly damaging it. She held it up once briefly between 2 fingers, then set it on the machine's footboard and began resetting the chain guide. Tuck Renner, standing at the edge of the group that had gathered around the thresher, said to no one in particular that he had looked at that machine for 4 days, and had not seen what she found in an hour. He said it without embarrassment and without drama, simply as a statement of observable fact, which was the only kind of statement Tuck Renner generally found worth making. Garrett said nothing. He was watching his new farm manager's hands move over the chain assembly, with the specific economy of motion that belongs to people who have done a thing enough times that every unnecessary movement has been removed from it, and he was experiencing the particular discomfort of a man whose carefully maintained doubt is being taken apart in real time, one solved problem at a time. He thought about Alderton Beck. He thought about the contract he had reviewed twice and signed and lost a season's revenue over. He had told himself since Beck that he would never again extend trust, before the proof was in front of him. That descriptions and credentials and confident letters were the currency of people who needed something from you. And that the only reliable evidence was demonstrated work. Watching Nessa work, he understood with a clarity that sat uncomfortably alongside his growing respect, that he had applied that principle selectively and badly. He had withheld advanced trust from his new hire, a woman he had not yet seen work, and had extended it without question to 4 mechanics from town whom he had also not, strictly speaking, seen work before they arrived. The difference in how he had extended or withheld that preliminary credit was not, he was forced to admit to himself, about evidence at all. It was about something else entirely. Something he did not have a clean name for, and which he liked considerably less the more clearly he could see it. The machine ran at 20 minutes before sundown. Nessa started it slowly, let it run at reduced speed for 2 minutes, brought it up to operating speed and held it there. The cylinder drum turned without hesitation, without the grinding complaint that had announced the original seizure, without any sound at all except the normal working sound of a machine doing what it was built to do. The fragment was gone, the guide was reset, the chain ran true. The group around the thresher was quiet for a moment. Then Dolph Stroud started clapping, and the field hands joined him, and Tuck Renner allowed himself a slow nod that in his own economy of expression meant approximately the same thing as everything the others were saying out loud. Garrett stood at the edge of the yard with his arms no longer crossed. Nessa shut the machine down, wiped her hands on a work rag, and walked to where Garrett was standing. She said, without triumph in her tone, "None of the flavors of 'I told you so.' None of the particular satisfaction of having proven something. That the machine should hold through the harvest, provided the guide was rechecked after the first full day of operation. Garrett said he would see to it." Nessa said, after a pause, that she had a question for him, and that she hoped he would take it in the spirit it was intended. He said she could ask it. She said. The 4 mechanics from town who had worked on the machine before her, had he questioned their capability when they arrived? Had he looked at their tools when they pulled up and thought seriously about whether they were suited to the work? Garrett said no. He said they were mechanics. He had assumed they knew their trade. Nessa said that was fair. She said she was asking because she was curious about the difference between his assumption about them and his assumption about her. She said she was not raising it to make a point. She was raising it because she would be managing this operation, and she needed to understand how the man she worked for formed his assessments, because that would shape every decision they made together, for as long as she was here. Garrett was quiet for long enough that Dolph Stroud, still standing nearby, developed a sudden intense interest in the fence line to give the conversation its appropriate privacy. Garrett said finally that he owed her an honest answer, and that the honest answer was that he didn't have a good one. He said his doubt about her had come in before she had done anything to earn it, and his lack of doubt about the town mechanics had come in exactly the same way. He said that was not the kind of man he had intended to become, and that he suspected he had become it anyway, somewhere in the 2 years since a business arrangement had gone badly. And he had decided the safest thing was to doubt everything until it proved itself. He said he had applied that rule more evenly in his mind than he had in practice. Nessa said she appreciated the honesty. She said that in her experience, the men who admitted that plainly were considerably rarer than the men who had the problem, and that she respected the difference. She said, "I fixed the machine, Mr. Foss. I would like to fix the harvest too, if you will let me do the job you hired me to do." Garrett said he would be grateful for it. The storm came in 2 days later, earlier than anyone had predicted. The wheat in the upper fields was already in the barn. What Garrett paid in the months that followed was not the kind of debt that shows up in a ledger. He began consulting Nessa before making equipment decisions, then before making field decisions, then before the broader operational decisions he had previously made alone by habit and stubbornness. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that she was right more often than he was. Not because she knew his land better, but because she brought a specific structural way of thinking about problems that arrived from a different direction than his own, and therefore caught things his thinking missed. He stopped explaining his reasoning to her as though she needed to catch up, and began treating their disagreements as what they actually were. 2 different working methods applied to the same problem, each of which saw something the other didn't. Nessa, for her part, found in the Foss farm something she had not found in New Mexico. Not ease, exactly, but the particular professional satisfaction of being in a place where her judgment was consulted rather than merely tolerated. She had not expected to stay beyond the harvest season. She stayed 4 years. Dolph Stroud, who had been present the afternoon the thresher ran again, began sending for Nessa when equipment trouble arrived on his own farm. Problems his hands could not diagnose quickly. which was most of them. Garrett, rather than objecting to the demands on her time, took a quiet satisfaction in the fact that the county had figured out what he had figured out, and that what they had figured out was something he had very nearly dismissed in the first hour of her first afternoon. Tuck Renner stayed on as foreman for another 9 years, and told the story of the threshing machine to every new hand who arrived at the farm, adding each time that the lesson he took from it was not about equipment, it was about what you already think you know about a person, before they've had a chance to show you anything, and how much that prior thinking costs you, if you're not careful about where it came from. The storm that arrived 2 days after the machine ran was one of the worst of the decade in Dolores County. 3 neighboring farms lost portions of their harvest because their equipment had failed, and they had not yet found their way to a solution. The Foss wheat was safe. I've thought about Garrett Foss and Nessa Caldwell many times since I first heard this story. And the thing I keep returning to is not the machine. It's the question Nessa asked him at the edge of that equipment yard, when the work was finished and the machine was running, and she could have simply accepted the win and moved on. She didn't ask it to shame him. She asked it because she needed to understand the man she was going to work with. And because she understood, the way people do who have spent enough years being underestimated, that the moment after you've proven yourself is the only moment in which that particular conversation can be had honestly. Garrett had built his doubt into something he thought was wisdom. Nessa dismantled it the same way she diagnosed the thresher, not by force but by showing him exactly where the real problem was. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone's quiet competence dismantle a doubt you didn't know you were carrying? And if you want another story about a judgment made too fast and a person patient enough to outlast it, the next one is already waiting for you.